All right, everyone. Hello. I am LaShonda Woods Roberts. I am a staff attorney at Georgia Appleseed as well as Atlanta Legal Aid Services, and we are here to discuss supporting children who are aging out of care. We want to talk a little bit about special education services and some disability programs and waivers that are available to the youth that you all serve. Jack, you want to introduce yourself?
And my name is Jack Grody. I'm a staff attorney with the Atlanta Legal Aid Disability Integration Project as well. I'm going to be here talking with y'all with LaShonda.
All right. So before we get started, I do want to make you aware of our post-training survey. We love at Georgia Appleseed and Atlanta Legal Aid to hear from you all, to know what topics you would like for us to cover in future trainings and what information you want more elaboration on or resources from or anything that sparks you, right? So we can be aware of what direction to go in when we meet again. So the link is here, but we'll drop it in the chat and we'll share it again before we're done today. But I just wanted to make you aware and encourage you to complete that survey because it really helps us make sure that everything that you need is done and we have resources to support you. So just an overview of today's presentation, we're going to just give you a little bit of background on both the DIP office as well as Georgia Appleseed. I'm going to give a very brief special education overview because I know you all want to hear a lot about the disability piece because there's so much there that isn't common knowledge to a lot of people who support youth. And I'll tell you a little bit about our tribunal project over on the Georgia Appleseed side, and we'll go into a Q&A where you can ask us any questions that you have after the presentations. So I do ask you to engage during the presentation through chat. We're going to probably hold the questions for that Q&A session so that we can get through all of the information. But please, when it comes to mine, go ahead and drop it in the chat so we can have it there to go back to.
So real briefly, the Disability Integration Project at Atlanta Legal Aid was kind of birthed out of the Olmstead decision, which was a case brought by Atlanta Legal Aid, which says that it is discrimination under the ADA to not provide services in a home and community-based setting. So that's what LaShonda and myself and a couple others at Atlanta Legal Aid do, specifically advocate for people who are either institutionalized in a nursing home, a psychiatric facility, or someplace else, or at risk for being institutionalized, and fighting for them to get services in their home so that they can stay in their community and receive better health outcomes and just live a better, more fulfilled life.
Thanks, Jack. And I'll tell you a little bit about Georgia Appleseed. Well, primarily we work to advance justice for all of Georgia's children. We focus on children who are experiencing poverty, children who are living with disabilities, and especially those children who are experiencing racism and bias due to their race or even their LGBTQIA status. So we work really, really hard to make sure that we meet these priority issues and offer supports and resources to everyone throughout the state as much as possible. So our three priorities for this year are, number one, keeping kids in school and out of the criminal justice system. If we can increase those supports behavior-wise or even intervention-wise, we could save a lot of children some educational hours, right? We also work to promote supports such as the school-based behavioral health. It's a very important piece of our work. And of course, ensuring that children and families have safe, stable, healthy housing. That's very important to us. So just wanted to give you a little bit of information about Georgia Appleseed, and we're going to jump again right into the special education piece. I will move a bit fast, but I do want you all to feel very comfortable and free to email myself or Jack if there's any particular topic or piece that you want to elaborate on, or if you have something going on with one of your clients that you want us to probably help you with. So feel free, again, to email us at any time. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of the three laws that are in play when it comes to education at the school level, with IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, being the most powerful or protective law, of course, because it is an act itself for children living with disabilities, but it's limited to 13 exceptionalities. Under this particular act, you do have the free appropriate public education requirement, as well as under Section 504. This one doesn't have as much protection as the IDEA Act, but it does have a broader range of disabilities that are covered. And it doesn't have to be in writing, but like any practitioner, I will encourage, if you know a child who has 504 services and they don't have a plan in writing, absolutely encourage that parent or that school to get that plan in writing so it can follow them without problems. And lastly, you have the Americans with Disability Act, which is more so a reasonable accommodation act that works in conjunction with the other special education protections. Like if there's a child with maybe a visual impairment and a small screen in the classroom, that probably isn't reasonable, right? Or if there's a child in a wheelchair and there's no on-ramp to get into the building and someone has to lift the chair up over the stairs, that's a problem. So that's when the ADA comes into play. So I just wanted to make sure you were aware of the three important laws, federal laws that help drive protections for children with disabilities. All right, so under the IDEA, there are 4 basic pieces, right? A child is identified by way of the school through a child fine obligation, right? If there is some evidence or some type of notice that this child may be experiencing a disability that prevents them from fully accessing their education, the school is obligated to identify that child and get them evaluated. And from that identification, that also could come from a parent requesting an evaluation because they've seen signs or a doctor has shared some potential disabilities with them. They have the evaluation process that goes on, and then the eligibility is determined, right? So they've been identified, they've been evaluated. So the IEP team is developed to review all of that data to determine whether or not this child is eligible for services under IDEA. And from that determination, if they are eligible, then they determine where that placement will be. So just a quick overview again, with IDEA and 504, children should have access to their free appropriate public education. And that goes until they are age 22. If they are still eligible for services, they can stay in school until they turn 22 years of age. And it's very important that you are aware as an advocate for your children that parents can invite others to meetings, including you. If you had time to join in a meeting, the parent has the right to bring other advocates or others who are aware and know this child. And I also wanted to call to your attention, since you are working particularly with DFACs and other advocates who are specific to children in foster care, there is some misinformation about the definition of parent. Parent does not include the state. If the child is a ward, we know that there are some districts who do allow for case managers to sign or serve as a parent for IEP purposes. But I did want to make you aware that in Georgia, they have adopted the federal definition of parent, and that does not include the state or any state representative. So just so you can know, if it comes up, it might be an issue along the way if something goes to court. But because it's just not broad information, I wanted to make you aware so you can also inform some case managers about this law. So when we talked about that placement piece, the child should be placed in the least restrictive environment possible. Of course, the least restrictive being a general education classroom amongst peers in the mainstream. And the most restrictive is home-based services or a separate school or a separate classroom altogether. So any planning that's done around a child who's receiving services under the IDEA should try to at least aim for getting that child in the least restrictive environment possible, determined by the IEP team. And IEP, a lot of people call it the individualized education plan. It's the individualized education program, right? And within this, it's supposed to be very specific to the needs of that child. It should not be just a boilerplate template that's adopted from child to child. It really should be only for that child of record, right? And this often includes, of course, the parents, educators, general and special education, other representatives from the district, school psychologists. There might be a member of the community who knows this child very well, and these are all important members of the team. And during these meetings, they oftentimes review evaluations and other data that's been collected to determine what those services will be, what those modifications to the instructional plan will be, how would they accommodate these children as they are learning their content material. And also, I wanted to call your attention to particularly one of the exceptionalities under IDEA, other health impairment. Through this particular exceptionality, there's some room to pull in other disabilities that do not fall on the list. Because if there is something like asthma or Tourette syndrome or something that's causing this child not to fully access their education, other health impairment might be a tool or an exceptionality vehicle to get them the services that they need. All right, so just some things to remember about special education. If the school determines that it's a child fine and they need to get a child evaluated, once they get that parental consent from that parent, or even if the parent requests the evaluation, they have 60 days to complete that initial evaluation. That's the law. Even during the pandemic, those timelines still are what they are. The parent and the IEP team may agree to extend that timeline under the circumstances, but the law has not changed. It's still 60 days to complete any initial evaluation. So if you have a client and you're aware that this parental consent was received by the school and it's been 6-7 months, might be worth a nudge to remind them or check in on that consent and see why that evaluation has not been completed. Again, a parent or caregiver is a part of the IEP team. They should feel like they're a part of the IEP team. They have a say in all of the decision-making of the team. And they also have a right to disagree. And there are several ways that we won't necessarily go in depth with today that they could use to challenge some of the determinations. That could be in the form of a state complaint or a due process petition, or even outreach complaint to the Office of Civil Rights at the federal level. But hopefully, things can be worked out without touching those sources, but there are ways that parents can protect their rights and pull in other people to help them. And of course, the IEP team meets at least annually to review those services and supports, because the idea is that children will reach their goals and they will need to have a different and individualized plan to meet them where they are at that time. So that the regular time is annually, but if you have a child, for instance, who is home-based, they're receiving home-based instruction, Georgia law requires that they have one every quarter. So there might be some nuances, but generally speaking, they're supposed to have a review of that IEP every year. So that's just a quick rundown of special education, but I did want to make you all aware of just a few other supports that are available to youth in schools. One being the student support team, right? This is a statewide mandate. Every school is supposed to have a student support team structure where they offer tiered supports, right? With the lowest tier being a broader reach across the board, and the highest tier being a more individualized plan. There are also behavioral and mental health supports available to children. Positive behavior intervention and supports may have some programs and activities that could help children who are struggling with behavior and learning challenges. Some schools have school-based health centers, and there might be some school counselor and social work programs as well. And then, of course, you all are aware of EPAC, the Education Programming Assessment and Consultation Group at DFACS. They also offer a lot of services to youth in school, and they have even their own assessments and tutoring services that they can offer the youth who are in care. And particularly for Fulton and DCAP, the Multi-Agency Alliance for Children has their education advocates available for 9th through 12th grade students. So if they are not already connected to MAC, they definitely need to be. So really quickly, I want to talk about the tribunal process. And just so everyone will know, we will send these slides out after the meeting to everyone who registered and who attended today. So I know I went through that very fast, but we'll send it out. Again, if you have any specific questions at the end of the slides, you'll find my 2 emails as well as Jack's, and you can feel free to email us at any time. So I just wanted to make sure I confirm that before we moved on. So I want to talk briefly about the tribunal process, because there is an important special education component in that process that might be relevant to your children. So for those who aren't aware, a child commits an offense, they're suspended for up to 10 days. Before those 10 days are up, they have to give that child and family notice that they're facing expulsion from school or some type of other change of placement. And if a child receives special education services, it's required of that district to complete a manifestation determination review, and that's done by the IEP team. And within that review, they essentially ask 2 questions. Was this behavior caused by or directly and substantially related to the student's disability? Or was it a failure of was it due to the failure of the LEA to implement their IEP appropriately? So just so you'll know, if it's yes to either of those questions, it's determined that that's a manifestation of the disability. The child should not have to undergo any type of consequences for that behavior. But there is an exception in IDEA that allows for districts and schools to change a placement for up to 45 days for 3 types of offenses, and that's drugs, weapons, or serious bodily injury. And serious bodily injury is not a scratch on the face. I'm talking about egregious maiming, broken bones, or something very, very extraordinary in order for that to be triggered, so long as it is determined that there's a manifestation of their disability. If it is not determined to be a manifestation of their disability, they can go forth with whatever consequence that they deem appropriate. However, the IEP team is still responsible for determining placement, right? So districts oftentimes have to balance respecting the decision of the tribunal officer, but also making sure that they are allowing this child to receive their free, appropriate public education. So at Georgia Appleseed, we have what's called the Student Tribunal Project, and this is exclusive to children in care. So we work very hard to identify attorneys across the state, and they get trained on serving these kids, and they are part of our Tribunal Volunteer Lawyers Network. We also work closely with Georgia Legal Services Program as well as Atlanta Legal Aid to get attorneys involved. And if you have a child who is facing a tribunal, please encourage, if you don't complete it yourself, encourage the case manager or the guardian ad litem of someone to complete this referral so we can try to get that child represented. And just so you can have some additional resources, and again, we will send this slide deck out. We have our help guides for children with behavior and learning challenges that goes over a lot of the things that I've talked about today in a very simple way that you can share with parents and caregivers. And we now have it available in Spanish and Korean. We also have the Georgia Legal Aid page that has the special education rights very specific to what we've discussed today. And we have the Tribunal Representation Manual. I've heard of several of the child attorneys joining children at the tribunal hearings. So here is another tool that can help you support them if you're available. But also we have the referral for those of you who may not have the time to take on that type of extra work. And so that is going to be it for me. Jack is going to take over now, but again, if you have any questions at all, add them to the chat and we will address them later. And again, I have to encourage you to feel free to reach out to any of us when you need some help with some special education or the disability waiver and program services. Thank y'all.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to now talk about various disability Medicaid waivers that are applicable to both children and adults, so that if you have children in foster care who need these services, you can get them hooked up to them now. And then as they start the aging out process, get them hooked up to the waivers that are appropriate for them as they age out. I also did want to mention at Atlanta Legal Aid, we have kind of started a little project where we have convinced a couple juvenile court judges, and so far just Cobb County, Gwinnett County, and DeKalb County to appoint us as special disability guardian ad litems when both the traditional guardian ad litem and DFACS agree that this is a kid who is aging out of care and they need a lot of help and need someone with a little bit more expertise to come in and make sure that they are getting access to the programs that they need to succeed when they age out. So if anyone in Fulton is ever interested in that, definitely let us know. Of course, there are just 4 of us, so we have limited capacity, but it's an exciting new thing that we've started the last couple of years. So I'm going to try to distill all this in about 30 minutes so that we can have some time for questions at the end. Medicaid waivers are unnecessarily complicated. They have a whole lot of moving parts, so I'm going to try to go as succinctly as possible, but if you have further questions, definitely feel free to reach out. So first off, what is a Medicaid waiver? Essentially, as we have progressed as a society. Like I said, at Disability Integration Unit, we try to get people out of institutions. For the longest time, Medicaid was paying for people to be locked up in an institution, whether or not it's a psychiatric facility or a nursing home or some other institution. And as we have realized that that is not good for society, it's not good for health outcomes, it's not good financially, and it's not good for the person. We have moved towards a model of community-based services. Of course, that is not a perfect model. It is far from perfect, but it is the direction we seem to be moving. So Medicaid, the Medicaid Act was amended to allow states to apply for waivers. Each state can do it kind of however they want. So if you hear about ways things are done in Georgia, it's going to be completely different in Alabama. It's going to be completely different in every other state. Every state can pick how many they want, what services they will include, what the target population they will include. And the biggest thing really is it's not an entitlement program. Unlike traditional Medicaid, if you financially qualify, you go down to DFACS, they check a couple boxes and you get Medicaid, no matter if 10 people in the state qualify or 10 million people in the state qualify, as long as they meet those eligibility requirements, they get it. For the Medicaid waiver programs, the state can limit the number of people. So you are going to see me talk a lot about waiting lists in almost all of these waivers. So it's very important to get children signed up early because oftentimes it can take a very long time to actually get the services. And lastly, all of the waivers have pretty high income limits. I say high, but in comparison to most other safety programs. It's 300% of the SSI limit. So that's between $2,200 and $2,300 a month. So pretty much every one of your foster kids should be able to financially qualify. And so on the next slide, I have the various different waivers that we have here in Georgia. I've broken them down by which disability they operate under. If that sounds confusing to you, it is very confusing. Georgia has decided to really silo off the waivers. So that's one important thing to think about when you have your kid. I think the natural instinct is to go to what does this kid need and then ask for those services. But when we're talking Medicaid waivers, we first have to go to what is their primary diagnosis and then go from there. So in Georgia, we have two different physical disabilities waivers. And I'm going to go in each of these a little more in detail. We have the elderly and disabled waiver, which actually has two components to it, CCSP and SOURCE. And then we have the independent care waiver program, or ICWP. Then there is one developmental disabilities waiver, the now Comp Waiver. And then there are two that hopefully y'all have some familiarity with for children, GAP, the Georgia Pediatric Program, and CBA, the Community-Based Alternatives for Youth. So I'm going to start going into a little more depth with the children's ones, since hopefully y'all have a little familiarity with them, and then transition into what you should be thinking about as they age out and what programs you should be applying for. So CBA it's for children ages 5 to 21 who are either in or at risk to be in a PRTF, which is a psychiatric residential treatment facility. And the child or youth must have a primary mental health diagnosis. So this is the only Medicaid waiver for children with a primary mental health diagnosis. That I think is very important because again, we're talking about the state siloing everyone off. I know a lot of kids in care pick up 5, 6 diagnoses. They move around the state constantly. They're moving to different doctors. Each doctor wants to add a diagnosis, but doesn't want to subtract a diagnosis. So it's important to make sure that the primary diagnosis is mental health. Oftentimes we see kids who have autism, but another second or third diagnosis. So CBA would not necessarily be appropriate for them. If you are also unfamiliar with what a PRTF is, it's a psychiatric residential treatment facility. Again, in Fulton County, for most of our kids, that's Laurel Heights over on Briarcliff. That's for when kids are having some kind of a mental health crisis, go to a hospital and the hospital says, well, they need medication stabilization, they need intensive therapy, they need to be here for a couple weeks. So then they'll send them to the PRTF. And again, Laurel Heights is probably the big one in Atlanta, but there are a handful also around the state. So children are supposed to be getting the service either when they're at risk for going in or after they've been discharged. So of course, we don't want to send children to an institution if we don't have to, but also if they're already at the institution, we don't want to send them home without more supports. Otherwise, they'll just most likely revolve back. So every kid who is leaving a PRTF is supposed to be getting these services, which one of the problems is it's not really discussed with the parent, right? So a parent just hears these mythical services and doesn't really know what to expect. So on the next slide, I have some of the services you can get with CBA. As you can see, there's a whole long list of them. The ones I'm going to highlight that are the most important are the clinical and therapeutic services. I've found that those are really helpful for a lot of kids. There's a lot of really great counselors out there for children. I've also had a lot of CBA counselors come to IEP meetings, show up for other appointments. So they're really there to follow the youth around. But you can also get things like respite for the family, family supports and training, so that if a foster parent is overwhelmed and doesn't know what to do when the child is in crisis, they can get trained on that. You can get supported employment, which is really important for youth aging out of care. So there's a whole bunch of services you can get for kids who have a primary mental health diagnosis. The one problem is it's only for the most at-risk kids, those kids who are either leaving an institution or we think are right about to get institutionalized. So if you have a kid who you think is about to be institutionalized, definitely talk to their psychiatrist or whoever their primary care provider is and inquire about CVA services. And then so I'm certain you're thinking, if you have a kid with this, what happens when they transition into adulthood? The answer is we have a horrible network for adults. There is no Medicaid waiver for adults with mental health services. There's some history to that that I won't go through, but there are some services that are available. There's not nothing, but it's very hard to access them. You can't get to them through, one entryway like you can with a waiver. The best really thing you can do for an adult is an ACT team, which is an assertive community treatment team, which can provide a lot of the same services that CBA provides. The one difficulty with that is you have to be someone who has SPMI, which is severe and persistent mental illness, which again is a pretty high bar to meet. There are also some other programs that we have for adults, such as the Georgia Housing Voucher Program. However, that is really only for adults who are experiencing chronic homelessness. So the bad answer is there are not a lot of supports for adults with mental health issues, but there are stronger supports for children. So if you think that's going to be an issue, I encourage you to try to link up with providers when they are young so that you can really inquire with their providers about what are the hard network to navigate as they start becoming an adult. And then so on the next slide, I have the other waiver for children, which is GAP, which I would assume most of y'all have at least heard of. It's the Georgia Pediatric Program. So it is for medically fragile children, but they have to meet the level of care as necessary for admission to a hospital or a skilled nursing facility. So it is intended for children who have really advanced medical needs. The program is a little broader than that. It used to be that you could really only get skilled nursing hours with it, but now you can get some more services such as personal supports. It is what I call unofficially kind of a weaning waiver. And that means that oftentimes children are born severely medically fragile and need a lot of assistance. But naturally, as children age and grow and go through puberty, oftentimes that assistance goes down. It does not always, but there are a lot of students who grow up and require less needs than others. And so the purpose of GAP is really to train the parents, so that if you have a kid who is born and when they're young requires maybe a trach or something, and the parent has no idea what is a trach, I don't know how to operate that, you can apply for GAP and get a lot of hours to begin with, but the intention being that the parent is supposed to be watching and learning so that they can slowly start taking over some of those services. Of course, there are plenty of children who have some kind of a disability that they are never going to grow out of. It is not a disability that is ever going to improve. And so those children see similar hours throughout their childhood and then can transition into an adult waiver program. I'm going to talk about in a second about ICWP, which has specific mentions of how you transition from GAP to ICWP. Well, going back real quickly, a couple more things with GAP. One thing I wanted to note, during COVID, family caregivers are allowed to be paid. Before, mom couldn't say, well, instead of working, I would rather just stay home and care for my daughter. Can you all pay me to do that? Because obviously if I quit my job, I can't afford any of my bills. And the state always took a very hardline approach to that, saying, no, we could only pay for outside providers to come in. And then when COVID hit, they allowed family caregivers to be paid. It's unclear what's going to happen after that. My hunch is the state's going to go right back to not letting family members be paid. However, a lot of advocates are really pushing for the state to make that more permanent. And one little hiccup that y'all might not be aware of, I just found out about it a couple weeks ago, that with GAP, if you have GAP, you must receive what we call fee-for-service Medicaid, which is Medicaid direct from the state and not through a CMO. So with Deaf Kids in Care, they're all under AmeriGroup. So if you get a child on GAP, they will still have Medicaid, but it won't be through AmeriGroup. So you, in theory, aren't supposed to lose any of the services, but you would switch from having a case coordinator through AmeriGroup to a case coordinator through the state. Again, in theory, shouldn't affect anything, but that is one thing, again, I just found out about from one of my cases, and I think a lot of people at DFACS aren't aware about either. And so it can create some confusion if you try to get a kid on GAP. However, it's still a great thing to get them on GAP if they are eligible. And then, so moving on to ICWP, the Independent Care Waiver. Like I said, this is the adult version of GAP. It's for people with severe physical disabilities or a traumatic brain injury. You have to be between 18 and 64. So as your kids start to age up, and you can be on GAP till 21 and ICWP starts at 18. So when they're in that 18 to 21 range is when you need to start thinking about transitioning them. One of the good things about ICWP, I say it's 18 to 64, but if you were on it prior to 64, you can stay on it for the rest of your life. So it is a Medicaid waiver that can stick with you for the entirety of your life. To meet the qualifications for ICWP, you have to meet nursing home level of care, which that's a really complicated standard, and I'm happy to go into more details with it if any of y'all have any specific questions about it. But I think most people really understand, what does it take to get someone into a nursing home? I think most of us have either been through it with a parent or a grandparent, trying to figure out at what point do we think they need nursing home care. And so if you have a youth that you think is about at that point, we of course don't want children in nursing homes. It happens and it's horrible. So if you think they're at that point, then they're probably eligible for this waiver. And it's really a very comprehensive waiver. I say there are 2 technical levels of care you can get. If this person meets nursing home level of care, that means they can probably get 7 to 8 hours of services a day, which for a lot of people covers their entire needs. However, if you have someone who has way more complex needs and is being cycled in and out of hospitals, you can get hospital level of care. And so in that case, we see people getting upwards of 20, 22 hours a day of services. There is a waiting list. Right now, it's pretty short. It's only 3 to 6 months probably. So again, you need to get on it early. This isn't one of the ones you need to get on years and years before you need it, but there is a little bit of a waiting list. And then also, if you have a child who's on GAP, you should begin this process, I would say 9 months to a year before their 21st birthday. That's because, as you know, there's so much bureaucracy around this. It in theory should just be a flip of a switch, but it never is. DFACs will have to go into their system, switch their Medicaid. If they currently have a case manager or a provider who is only a GAP provider but isn't an ICWP provider, they will have to hire new people for that. And that process alone, we've seen take 5 to 6 months. So there's a lot of paperwork involved. You got to get new forms signed by doctors. So you definitely want to give yourself a lot of time to get them on that waiver. And then lastly, there are some what the equivalent of personal care homes are if you're under ICWP. They are very, very limited though. So I would not bank on, if you have a child who's receiving GAP services and they're 19, if you think, oh, if we can just get them onto ICWP and get them into a personal care home, that's a solution. Those are so small in number that it's really not a reliable outcome. However, this is a great program for people who want to live on their own, can live on their own, just need the additional hours of support. And there's, for all of these waivers, the applications are relatively simple, with the exception of the now Comp Waiver. For most of them, you just call the Georgia Medical Care Foundation. They're the people who come out and evaluate and determine eligibility. So if you think you have someone, just call that number and say, I'm working with a youth in foster care. I want to get them eligible for ICWP. And that's how you start the process. And then, so there's 2 other, what we call the elderly and disabled waivers, and I'll go through those really quickly. They are called CCSP and Source. I have slides with the differences between the 2 of them. However, they're pretty much identical. Really, the only difference is Source is exclusively for people who just receive SSI, and CCSP is for people who receive SSI or up to 300% of the SSI limit. It has the same standard for eligibility as ICWP, the nursing home level of care, but you aren't going to get the hours. And it's intended for people who are more independent. For CCS&P and Source, typically what I see is people who need 10 to 15 hours a week. So depending on their needs, I'll see people who get maybe 2 hours a day. They need someone to come in every morning, help them get out of bed, get in the shower, and then that person can leave. Or, they pack it all in and say, well, I just want someone coming Monday and Wednesday for 4.5 hours. So that way, they can be with me while I cook my meals for the week. We can go to the grocery store. We can do a handful of things and, knock them all off. So you aren't going to get an extreme number of hours for that. That is where the ICWP is intended really for people who are in a nursing home and want to get out. CCSP and Source is really intended for people who might need to be in a nursing home, but we just don't think they're quite there, and we want to prevent that from happening. They just need a little bit more support. But some of the other things you can get emergency response. So DCH will set up like a life alert button that you can have. You can get Meals on Wheels. That's a really great way to get Meals on Wheels. Personal support services, and you can sometimes get an adult day program if you have a high enough budget for it. And then again, the next 2 slides just kind of go into some of the specifics between the 2. Again, they're pretty much the same. One thing I do want to just caution, if you're trying to get someone through these programs, it is a 2-step level of care, meaning you called, again, it's all through GMCF, you call them and you just do a phone interview first. And the phone interview is really just to weed out, is it worth their time to do an in-person interview? So they use that process to try to be like, oh, you're not eligible, it's not worth it, we're just going to close your case. But I think that is technically a due process issue. So you can demand the in-person assessment and have them actually go out and do a formal evaluation. So if you're just getting hung up on, or someone's trying to convince you that it's not the right program, I try to stand my ground and say, no, we want the actual in-person assessment. And for both CCSP and Source, you apply through your Aging and Disability Resource Connection, which there are, I think, 12 or 13 around the state. So you just find the nearest one to the youth. And lastly, I don't think I mentioned, technically this is a program intended for adults, but there is no age requirement. I have 16-year-olds on it. I have 15-year-olds on it. I have 15-year-olds who have such complex needs. They're on a waiting list for one waiver, and it's going to be years before they get that waiver, but they also have serious physical needs. And source at least said, well, we can come out and do 10 hours a week, and the parent needs 90 hours a week, but they said, while I'm on the 5-year waiting list for the 90 hours a week, I will take 10 hours a week. So this is a really good program, I think, because there isn't a long waiting list. And you can get just a small number of hours relatively easily. The one issue with this is there is a cost share. So you're allowed to get it up to 300% of SSI. However, you have to pay back every dollar you get over the SSI limit. So if you have just SSI, it's a great program. Or if you have subsidized housing or housing that is paid for through some other service, it's a really good service. However, if you just have a private landlord, it can be very difficult because, for example, if you are getting a $1,400 Social Security check and you want source, about $620 is going to have to go to the source provider. And so if you don't have subsidized housing or housing that's paid through some other means, and in Fulton County, you're not getting a landlord who's going to accept $700 or $600 for rent. So for foster youth who are trying to age out and live on their own, it can be a little difficult if they're not already hooked up to some kind of housing. And then real quickly, and if we can skip that slide too, moving on to now comp. This is the big waiver. This is the waiver you probably heard about, but never seen anyone on. This is the one everyone wants. It is for people with developmental disabilities, and it is an absolutely fantastic waiver because you can get just about anything. However, it's the hardest to get on. So I'll try to go through pretty quickly how to be eligible. There are two ways to be eligible. One, you have an intellectual disability. It has to be documented before age 18. And to document it, you have to have IQ testing that says you have an IQ below 70. That's the only way we can prove you had an intellectual disability. So on the one hand, that can be really hard for certain clients, but on the other hand, y'all are in a really great position because all that means is at your next IEP, if you see that they have an intellectual disability written down somewhere, ask for, and you don't have a recent IQ test, ask the school to do it. That's how we get most people eligible is a school psychoeducational that has an IQ test. You also have to have 2 areas of functional impairment, and I'm going to go through the areas in just a second. The other is you have to have a related condition before age 22 and at least 3 areas of functional impairment. The documentation of the ages is very important. We have had the state fight us when a kid got an IQ test at 18 and 5 months, and they said he wasn't before the age of 18. And so we don't know that he had this during the developmental period. So it is very important while you're working with these youths now, since they are below these ages, to really help be a record keeper because they are seeing these doctors now, they are getting these IEPs, and keep all that files because even if they aren't eligible for now comp right now or don't need now comp right now, we don't know down the road they might need it. And for a lot of our clients who are 50, 60 trying to get on, who the school has destroyed their records, we might not have any records from before they were 18, and then it's really hard to get these services. So related condition, again, that's the second way you can get on. That's defined as either cerebral palsy or epilepsy or anything else other than mental illness that manifests itself similar to intellectual disability. So it's a pretty broad category. However, you have to have the very similar functional impairments like an intellectual disability. And so the areas, if you see in the second bullet, D, are the areas in self-care, learning, mobility, understanding and use of language, self-direction, and capacity for independent living. So for an intellectual disability, you have to have impairments in 2. For related conditions, you have to have it in 3. So even if you meet the definition, it might not be enough. I have plenty of clients who have autism, which is a related condition. We have tons of children with autism on the waiver, but if they are able to bathe and get dressed and they're doing decent in school, and they have no mobility issues, they might not qualify for the waiver. So you really have to have both areas. Also, if you don't have all the documentation, so say you have a kid and he's 19 and you don't have the documentation before he was 18, you can do it through affidavits of people who knew them when they were younger. That's also going to be difficult for kids who are in care. So if you have a kid who is in care and right now you have access to his birth mother, it might be a good time to touch base, because we don't know down the line if she's going to be out of the picture and then we're never going to be able to find her again. So unfortunately, like I said, we have too many clients who are older and don't have access to their family members anymore, which is also unfortunately the reality for a lot of kids who are aging out of care. And then so on the next slide, I'm going to go through all the kind of things you can get with the now Comp Waiver. Again, it's pretty much anything. So you can get personal support services, which is just any person coming in the home to help. You can get behavioral supports, to where you can get a licensed behaviorist who's going to come in and work with the person on their problem behaviors and try to correct them. There are group homes, host homes, which is really the big one, because this is really the only waiver where you can readily get living space. And you can also get community access supports, which is like a day program, or just getting someone in the house who's going to take you out to the park every day so you're out and about in the community. The real problem with this waiver is there are 7,000 people on the waiting list. And the state allocates 125 new waivers a year. So you do the math on that, to get that waiting list down to 0 is like 100 years. The good news, at least for y'all, is the planning list is most in need. And when we're talking 125 slots a year, to get those slots, you have to be the most in need, means you have to be cycling out of something. You have to have absolutely no family support. So the people we see get these waivers are foster youth aging out of care who have nowhere to go, or people going out of prison who have no family, someone being released from a psychiatric facility and has nowhere to go. So it's unfortunate for for the youth you're working with, but it does mean that they are likely to be higher up on the planning list than a lot of other people. So apply early. I advise people to apply 14, 15, years before you think it's necessary. If you get approved, you do get a planning list administrator, which is someone who's supposed to check in on y'all a couple times a year. They just changed the number. So it used to be monthly, and now I think it's quarterly, to get an update. What's going on with the person? Do they need to be moved up the list? Do they need to be moved down? So that you can constantly be in check with them. And as you know information about the kid, let them know. So if you know they're on the waiting list and they're 19 and they're going to age out at 21, now's a good time to bring it up to their administrator. We have 2 years until they age out. We want to start talking about what can happen. And then lastly, there's no age limit on it. Any person can get it. However, the state really does like to prioritize non-children, because children can get most of the services through EPSDT. So I've seen kids on it. I have gotten kids on it, but because you can get these services through EPSDT, it can be a little harder for kids. But as you're aging out, you no longer have access to EPSDT. So it can be a little easier to get the kids on off the waiting list. And then just real quick, lastly, I just want to mention, if you apply for any of these programs, of course, you have rights. So if you get denied any of the programs, you can appeal it. And so I would encourage you all to appeal it, but also if you want, call me. This is what I do all day. So I'm more than happy to talk with anyone about whether or not it's a good appeal, and or if you want to have me work on it, we can discuss that as well. But essentially you have 30 days to appeal. If you're already getting the services, you want to appeal within 10 days to keep the services going. You send the appeal to the agency you applied for. So if you applied for the physical disabilities waiver, you send it to DCH. And if you applied for the developmental disabilities waiver, you send it to DBHDD. And then they have 30 days to send it to the Office of State Administrative Hearings. And then you get a notice in the mail saying when your hearing is. And again, the hearings are complicated and complex, so give me a call and we can chat. And I see we have a bunch of questions in the chat. So let's see if there are anything. Yeah, so I see there's one question about mental health diagnoses and what diagnoses are persistent mental illnesses. So that is not a, it's not related to diagnoses. It's about how severe and how often they are. So any mental health diagnoses can be considered severe and persistent. It's about how often you're having flare-ups, how often you're having to be hospitalized, how often it's affecting your housing. So if you have a kid who's going to the hospital 2-3 times a year, that's severe and persistent. It doesn't really matter if it's schizophrenia or bipolar or ODD or anything. It's really more about the severity. So think about looking at your kids who are very constantly being cycled in and out. I see a question about what events can get your aging out child moved up on the Now Comp waiting list. So things like, well, aging out if there is no other option for housing. If this child is going to be homeless without it, that is a huge major event. Of course, we want to tap into every resource possible to find housing for our youth aging out. But if you know this is a kid who's absolutely unable to live on their own, has no family they can move in with, has no other resources, that is something I would definitely bring to the state's attention. Other things would just be the severity of the needs. Again, if you see that they're being hospitalized, that's something about talking about getting them on the waiver. If you have, I see a lot of kids who are being sent out of state for institutions. If DFACS is telling you there's no other option, we're going to send them to Devereaux in Florida, that's a very extreme measure. So that's when you might want to have conversations with DBHDD of saying, hey, we don't want to send this kid to Devereaux. Can you provide more services? And there are also some services you can get while on the waiver. They're very minimal, but there are, while you're on the waiting list, I mean, you can get family support services, which only offer $3,000 of aid a year, which is obviously nothing when you have a child of these needs. But it also, you get another case manager that way, and you get someone else to the table who can link you up with services. Are there any other questions? We have on the last slide here another link to the survey as well as contact information for me and LaShonda. But if anyone has any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask. Or if you just want to follow up with an email, that's fine too. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, it was really nice talking to you all, and thanks for inviting LaShonda and I. Again, we are always available and here, and feel free to reach out to us. And we are going to be sending this PowerPoint out to all of y'all. And we recorded it. Are we sending that to them, LaShonda?
Yes, we'll send the link to the recording as well as the resources. And Caroline did drop in the chat our recently released Medicaid and Peach Care Appeals Manual for Attorneys. So it goes right along with everything we talked about today. So I'll make sure that you have the link to that in the documents as well.
And that is a Georgia Appleseed thing, but I'm going to sing their praises because it's fantastic. And I have used that when I'm appealing a lot of Medicaid things. So if you have any appeals questions, that's really a really great starter. But just also, while we're talking about appeals really quickly, there's so many things you can appeal. So don't be shy to appeal things. They're a lot of fun. And the state is also just constantly trying to get away with not providing medical resources. And they try to scare you into not appealing when they're all oftentimes on the wrong. So it's always fun to just appeal and watch them shake a little bit. So yeah. Well, thank you all. And we'll be sending out all that information.
And please take the time again to complete the survey. I dropped it again in the chat, but it's on the screen as well, because we definitely love to hear from our attorney partners. So please complete that survey for us. And I know that we ask information about your residency, particularly for those who do reside in Fulton County, because we are a partner with Fulton County through the CSP programming, and those numbers help us get more funding to do things like this. So definitely complete that survey. Let us know if there's more information or trainings you're interested in. And also just thank you. Thank you for coming today. Thank you, Jack, for a wonderful presentation. Every time I hear from you, I learn so much. So thank you. It's so clear now. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. See you, Ms. Davis. See you later, Vanna. Is it Vanna or Vanna, Ms. Wilson?
Vanna. Thank you so
okay.
much. It was very helpful being a newbie watching this. It was great.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for coming.